Hello and welcome to the Armenian News Network Groong Week in Review. I'm Asbed Bedrossian, and along with Hovik Manucharyan, this week we're going to talk about the following major topics: Armenia's elections, behind the scenes with Armenia and Azerbaijan, Erdogan in Azerbaijan, Biden meets Erdogan, then Putin.
And this week we have our regular team, Asbed Kotchikian and Emil Sanamyan, with us. Asbed Kotchikian is an associate professor of political science and international relations at the American University of Armenia, and Emil Sanamyan is a senior research fellow at USC's Institute of Armenian Studies, specializing in politics in the Caucasus. Hello and welcome, gang.
Hello, thank you.
Hi. Hello, everyone.
So this week, we're going to be talking about a lot of things that happened, and probably can't do justice to all of them at the same time, but we will try. I think we should begin by the major development in Armenia this week, which was the early parliamentary elections. We're talking just as the polls closed in Yerevan. There are various data that are being provided during the day. Some of the highlights are that voter participation was, based on the numbers at 5 p.m. in Yerevan time, there were around 990,000 voters. And this is, I think, on par with the 2018 election. Hrant Mikhaelian, I guess, an analyst who's frequently on our show, said that this is actually higher than expected. So we can talk about that. What happens now is the Central Election Commission, or CEC, has 24 hours to tabulate the preliminary results. I believe they will provide updates as we speak. So by the time you hear this, you may have more information than we're able to give you right now. Some other major highlights are that the highest in terms of voter turnout were in Syunik and Yerevan, among others, with Yerevan being the biggest voting population, I think about 30-something percent. There's also a lot of Tavush, Vayos, Zor were also high, but those are relatively small in terms of population. And the lowest turnout was in Armavir, Shirak, and Gegarkunik, which is interesting. I think all those three may be big Pashinyan support bases. Emil, are you following the polls? And if so, please, part your impressions with us.
I'm following the polls to the extent that I can via internet, even though I have to say, whenever I would be in Armenia, including for elections, the picture that you get seems much more fragmented and narrow than when you're outside of Armenia looking from outside. Overall, I would say, if we go back to the sort of rhetoric of days bygone, this is an important step in Armenia's democratic development. We look at the history of the Armenian elections. The notion has always been that the challenger is outgunned and has no chance of winning. This is the first Armenian election, probably with the exception of 1996 election, which was also close, or at least near the second round, where challenger seems to have a very strong shot at winning, either directly or through coalition arrangements. So that kind of reality that Armenians are experiencing right now is new. If challenger wins, even though it is an ex-president, still, if a challenger wins, it will be the first time when a challenger wins in an election, rather than through protests or through protests essentially, which is what happened in 2018 and also in 1990. You could say that through the public pressure, there was a switch in parliament composition at the time, and Leon Bedrossian was elected first as chairman of parliament and later as president, already being in power. So this is going to be, of course, not an easy process. Say if Kotchikian wins as expected from the polls and from sort of the dynamics of the election, how that transition will occur. Because, of course, there's a lot of hostility between the current government and Robert Kotchikian. As he said in his interview, it's hard for him to be in the same room with Pashinyan. So we'll see how that transition goes. Hopefully it goes peacefully. So far, the election process has been very orderly overall. I think that system that has been created in terms of sort of voter identification, authentication, the observation in terms of cameras, and generally the orderliness of Armenian elections have been increasing over the past 10 years. With the new technologies introduced and just the culture introduced of going to elections and choosing. And if in the, say, 2017 election you still had one kind of party in power that remained undefeated, today, through this unfortunately very, very tragic and very, very costly process of new government coming in, since 2018, and possibly losing this time, Armenians are acquiring this ability, sense that they can change their government and change it wherever that's necessary.
Yeah, I would like to add, I mean, I agree completely with what Emil said. A couple of things I think so far, again, just at this point, we cannot give definitively what kind of results we're expecting. And I have argued elsewhere as well that this is probably the most competitive election that Armenia witnessed. And I have also been following in terms of the number of complaints registered by the police and the number of arrests in terms of people trying to distribute money, in terms of buying votes, but also voting twice and so on and so forth. So it seems to be more transparent, which is, I think, overall good indicators. And one other thing I would like to add is that regardless of the number of people in terms of the regions, and I think Hovik did mention this, but it's interesting that Sunik, Vayotsor, Davush have the highest turnouts, not surprisingly because of the border area. And obviously they have concerns and probably they are motivated by the issue of security. Interestingly, Gevarkunik, which is another border area, it's high still, but it's not as high as the other border regions. So this is something to keep in mind. We have discussed before that a higher voter turnout usually would prefer the incumbent, but also the distinctions between rural versus urban areas. So that's also a factor to keep in mind, even though you might end up seeing higher voter turnout in Vayotsor or Davush, but in major cities might not be as high as in rural areas. So I think the waiting game starts now, and the anticipation is whether or not within the next 6 days, probably until our next weekend review session next week, there will be a coalition or not. That's one thing for sure, that there will be a coalition.
Asbed, you mentioned that in terms of complaints or violations, things were better this time. I was following the news throughout the night, and the things that stood out to me were the two gunshots, the two shooting incidents. I don't know if we ever had this in the past elections.
Well, Hovik, don't forget that in this context, this has been one of the major issues that have also been included in some of the polls, right? In terms of the violent incidents have been on the rise in the last couple of months in Yerevan, in Armenia in general. Looking at various conflict areas, like in places where you would have war and so on and so forth, obviously weapons are more readily available, so people are more inclined to use it. But I'm surprised that there hasn't been much more gunshots and gun incidents during the elections than I was expecting.
Yeah, and I'm surprised we have elections, to begin with.
We're all surprised. Let's see if the surprise will continue.
I think there's always been isolated incidents like that. Of course, whenever it suited mostly opposition parties, they would highlight some kind of violent incident. But, they would always be isolated, or almost always would be isolated in terms of the election day and the voting day. One thing I wanted to note about the high turnout in Sunik and to an extent in Vayotsor is that that's always been very high in every election going back to Kotchikian presidency. And the reason is those provinces have small populations. Proportionately, they have high military presence, always had. So there is always soldiers voting in Zangezur, in Vayotsor, especially in Sunik. As a matter of fact, the way it would happen in the past when Armenian army was in Karabakh, soldiers from Karabakh would come and vote in Terh and Goris and other locations inside Republic of Armenia, who are drafted from Republic of Armenia. So that's what's happening today as well in terms of the high number of Sunik voters. Of course, overall total number, that's still very small compared to the rest of Armenia. So I don't think that is significant, but the high turnout, or relatively high turnout in Yerevan is definitely significant because this is, the largest constituency. Again, it showed that Kotchikian had a relative advantage in Yerevan over overall provinces, except for Sunik. That's definitely a sign of positive news for Kotchikian. And one other thing to keep in mind as the results start to trickle out after midnight is that usually the first results that come in, they come from small constituencies, meaning small rural constituencies, because that's, it's fewer votes to count and it's quicker to complete the counting for the precinct to report. So initial reports will be coming from rural areas or small constituencies, and then as the voting progresses, the Yerevan results will start to come out as after they're tabulated. Obviously, you have largest precincts are in Yerevan, so you will see numbers change overnight and into the morning and day tomorrow.
Yeah, so I just someone sent me this link, dashboards.elections.am. So if the results are still not clear by the time you're listening to this, you can go to this dashboard site and I think they still have the numbers from 5 p.m. One thing that's I think unique to the Pashinyan administration, both in 2018 and this time, was launching a lot of criminal cases and so forth right before the elections. A lot of people, when they talk about election violation, they talk about day of events such as ballot box stuffing and all the other irregularities that happen. Just yesterday, they had, I believe, Fatih Vunem announced that 40 of their party members were arrested, without any warrants, without, out of the blue. And, of course, and today, during election day, a lot of the Hayastan Dashing members were arrested. The representative, the spokesperson for Hayastan Dashing, Vartevanyan, said that essentially they, without any court order, they searched their offices and cars and homes, and then they called. But the investigation was launched in Yerevan, so they had to go to Yerevan to provide a statement and then come back. Vartevanyan was saying that this is calculated to essentially disrupt the activities of the campaign rather than actually being a legitimate criminal case.
To waste their time.
Yeah, essentially. What do you think about that? Are we seeing a more sort of a different kind of election tampering where, the administrative resource component is much higher than before? Or maybe it's in a different form?
I would say it's a bit in a different form. And I would argue that Pashinyan the current government doesn't have a strong hold of administrative resources as the previous incumbents did, as Emil mentioned as well.
Yeah, I agree with what Asbed is saying. I mean, this sort of harassment of your opponents has been sort of present, maybe to a different degree, maybe somewhat less, but I mean, there was more of it overall, I would say, or at least a sense of it that there's more of it back in the 90s and 2000s. But administrative resources are being used. There's evidence that, the rally that Nikol Pashinyan had, they would bus people. I mean, this is just, you can look at it from different perspective, but it's about organizing and bringing the right people to the right place, right? There has to be some element of organization happening there. And there are people locally, they're a different culture kind of. So you might have things like a member of the Kotchikian list who was talking to his employees, just like you had things like that in the past elections with sort of bosses talk to their employees, trying to turn them out to vote, trying to get people to vote. I mean, that's as long as it's happening without overt threat. I think it's a normal process that would be happening, that somebody who has some kind of authority would try to use it. Overall, I agree with Asbed that just Pashinyan is not good at organizing. And of course, because of this transition that remained incomplete. Think about it. It's been 3 years he's been in government, but the Constitutional Court, majority of it remained untouched. Courts, majority of them remained untouched. Even though, of course, Pashinyan tried to acquire them as assets for himself. He failed to do it. Lack of time, war, everything, COVID, pandemic,
attention,
all that interfered. Yeah.
Political ADD, probably.
Yeah.
But I mean, has it ever been so overt? So, for instance, actually, they modify. I disagree because they modified laws to specifically change the constitutional court members. They put Jahangiri on the power.
Yeah. But I mean, like I said, to this day, they don't have the same sort of extent of control over the courts as previous governments used to have. I mean, you mentioned that they're engaged in this harassment, arresting people, but by the time they're brought to courts look at their charges and throw them out, and that's been happening. That's been happening for many months now, essentially since November. I don't remember one case where clearly politically motivated case initiated by the government or prosecutor general or the police that would actually get court sanction eventually. So people, get detained for a certain time, but then get released.
But the opposition would say that the goal is not to arrest these people and get them charged, but it is the PR effect. I think that Pashinyan is very good at PR. He lives and breathes every day in terms of what things he can put in the newspapers, and If the goal is to show the public that the opposition is criminal and they're doing, all these bad things, then maybe this was a success. I don't know. But anyway, let's go on. I want to talk about polls. We've been talking about them every week. But before I do that, I don't know if this is a good idea or not, but I'm going to go on a limb and put my neck out and make a prediction, a crazy one. Earlier this week, I put together a quick article about how social media may affect election results. And specifically, I focused on Vartan Ghukasyan, who is this blogger, social media personality who just through his popularity on social media was able to get the Hayot Hayrenik party like a 0.5% running start. It's not much, but I've been following his YouTube channels, and over the last 2 days, despite there being a ban on being a day of silence, he has been doing 24/7 live broadcasts. And when I was looking at the view counts of his shows, it's pretty significant. It's like, altogether maybe over the last two days he's had like maybe 300,000-400,000 views. So I'm going to predict that his poll numbers are going to be actually much higher than 0.5%, which was, or less than 1%. I think the last MPG poll was less than 1%. I'm wondering whether this party will actually maybe even clear the threshold and be part of parliament. That'll be an interesting to watch out for. Any thoughts?
But I was wondering whose party that was, this Hayot Hayrenik. There are a lot of names like that. But yeah, now I understand that's that personality. I mean, we've had people like that before, right? Remember Tigran Karapetic, remember Eposaget, who recently got released after doing time for shooting Hayrikan, remember? So there's always been people like that. Of course, they generate some element of publicity, but that doesn't necessarily translate into like election day performance. Hopefully, that's going to be the case this time around as well.
Yeah, the million-dollar question that might be answered is that to what extent the polls were actually right on the money when it came to providing predictions. But then again, the day of the event, the day of the election, usually a lot of people do get motivated, and I'm not talking about motivated by others. And this is a phenomenon in Armenia as well as other places where people they drag their neighbors or they get excited. What are you doing? It's Sunday. We don't have anything to do. It's a lazy day. Let's go to vote and so on and so forth. So don't forget also that it's been there were a lot of reports about long lines, long waits in lines, and the fact that it's been a very hot day in Yerevan. These are all factors to consider. But again, the polls can only predict and, not only predict, they not only predict, but they can also motivate people to vote one way or another. If I were to see that the party that I support is ahead in the polls, I might have one of the reactions of saying, okay, they're winning, why bother go? Or I might get more motivation and say, okay, they're winning, let's go and give the final blow, or vice versa. So again, I've always been reluctant about the polls. It's nice, it's numbers. People think that because it's numbers, it's like a exact science. But the methodology, the length of time that people have worked on the poll, has it been over like a 1 week, 2 weeks, or 1 month, 2 months period? These are all will become moot after tomorrow, I think.
But think about it, a couple of points in defense of polls. Think about no polls, right? I mean, everybody claims that they're ahead. Everybody claims that they're the favorite. I mean, it would have been a much messier situation. Polls have, of course,
You're right.
They had problems with, I mean, it's hard. It cannot be an accurate prediction of what's going to happen. Obviously, there's always time delay. There's always sampling issues. But what pollsters in Armenia, especially MPG, I have to say, have accomplished, I already mentioned this before, is that they've accurately identified leaders of the race, order of that to the extent they're leading. And in the last election, the predictions that they had were very accurate. If you compare it to any kind of polling, maybe it wasn't that difficult because there was a clear favorite, but they, even in that case, they predicted the right number within 1 or 2 percentage points, right? And the same for the second and the third party, and pretty close for the fourth and the fifth parliament. So that doesn't guarantee that they'll always be as accurate, but gives them credibility that makes it possible to do predictions as we are doing.
We're going to have Aram Navasardian, head of MPG. I think we're scheduled to record tonight. Hopefully that happens, and we can also release that soon. There are a lot of questions I want to ask, especially when this new poll was released a few days ago from EVN Report. Have you seen it, Emil?
Yeah, I've seen it. That one wasn't very good, yeah.
So I'd like to talk about it, but just to let our listeners know, this one was starkly different in terms of predictions. It mentioned that civil contract had 24%, while Hayastan had 12%, so almost double the number of votes.
Yeah.
And all the rest of the single parties in single digits. What is your explanation for the fault in this poll?
As far as I gathered, and I didn't scrutinize the report or the poll in detail, from what I gathered, it has been compiled over a longer period of time with a lot of changes in between. One of the things about the MPG or the IRI polls is that they do it within a week period, so attitudes don't change that much. But this has been over a month or so, over a month period that they aggregated the data. So obviously that would skew the results. And of course, probably again, the resources that they had, or the lack of resources that they had in terms of contacting people or asking the questions and so on. But I felt that the main problem of the EVN poll or the article that appeared in the EVN report was basically lacks that a brevity of time in which questions were asked.
Right. Emil.
I mean, first of all, it's always, you always get a mix of different pollsters, especially in a country like Armenia. There's established ones that you have some kind of track record. There are established ones that are bad ones. Like, for example, I remember now late Aharon Adibekyan, Sociometer, which would always, seem completely ridiculous in terms of its numbers not adding up, whatever. I mean, and then there would be the Georg Bohosyan with the Armenian
But at the time, he
Sociological
had cornered
Association.
the market, didn't he?
He didn't quite corner it. He was always sort of the secondary kind of. But the Armenian Sociological Association had, some level of credibility. Georg Bohosyan, they're the ones collaborating with the American Gallup and Baltic surveys, and MPG also collaborating with Gallup International, the Swiss Gallup International, also had sort of established credibility. And then you would have, random pollsters come in. Sometimes, Russians would poll. And by the way, this time around, it was interesting that there was no Russian poll prior to the election. I mean, the main Russian pollster, VTSIOM, it's a Russian abbreviation, they didn't publish any polling data. But the RIA Novosti published some. And then we had this one from, I understand, individuals at University of Nevada, Las Vegas, right? So I looked at their biographies. I don't think they are pollsters, right? That's not their field of activity in sort of main field of activity. I don't think they've done any polling before.
I think that Rafael Oganyan, the person who either consulted or advised on this poll, they run the Armenia Elections study, and they have done polls in 2018 and I believe earlier.
I saw that reference, but I've never seen them before, so I can't really. I just haven't looked at their polls ever before. I never heard those names before in the context of polling. So that's possible. But then the glaring parts of the poll were things like results from Vayodzor, which only included like 4 respondents or 5 respondents. It would be like 100% for Pashinyan out of 4. Those kind of numbers, are not sociological numbers. I understand you can have a limited ability, but if it's that limited, it might be better not to aggregate numbers like 4 respondents out of the entire province or
1.
Overall respondent rate was fairly small. It was, I think, less than 400 people.
No, it was around 800 people.
No, 800 was the number they reached out to, but the number that got counted and responded was less than 400. I think it was 380, something like that. So it was a smaller sample than MPG's or any other poll that had come out, and it's just without having the track record, it didn't seem to me like. And compared to all the other polls that I saw, and I saw the MPG polls, I saw this Interakcja poll, which was done by this Ukrainian think tank guy. Again, not sure how credible. He kind of mirrored what the MPG was doing in terms of results. It seemed very similar. And then you had the RIA Novosti, again similar to MPG, with one big significant difference is how Serge Sargsyan's party was doing. He was doing better in MPG polling than in RIA Novosti polling. So that might be significant in terms of whether he passes into parliament or not. And this one that stood sort of completely outside of the mainstream sort of established by these 3 organizations. So we'll see what it's actually going to come out to, but...
Yeah, I guess we'll see if in a week we're all going to be put to shame for saying these things about EVN report.
Well, they always have that disclaimer, right? That this is not in any way going to predict, and it's rather showing the trend.
Right.
But Hovik, before we go on to the next topic, I just want to also mention one thing, that there are reports about the diplomatic community, Armenian diplomatic community, which is voting electronically and out of the country. About 300 of them or so. Overwhelmingly, they voted for Kotchikian, and the second they voted for I have honor Fatih Unem,
Yeah.
basically also reflecting the overall hold or the disenchantment of the Armenian diplomatic community with current administration, but also showing the hold, quote unquote, that the former presidents, Robert Kotchikian and Serge Sarkisian, have, in terms of most of them are their appointees, after all, one way or another. So it's interesting to see that. So
that actually I think includes diplomats and also members of their families. Mostly
right, right.
spouses, some maybe adult children.
Yeah.
I saw those numbers and they seemed kind of odd to me in terms of just such consolidated voting for Kotchikian and Serge Sarkisian. So I don't know how accurate they are, considering that we know ambassador to Sweden, or is it Sweden? I think there is the former leader of the Armenian National Movement, Ter Petrosyan's party. I don't know what their relations are right now like. Or Bayburtian in Los Angeles, who again was Ter Petrosyan appointee for a long time, and then is an appointee of Nikol Pashinyan. I can count on my hands, just out of my memory, a number of current ambassadors who are not either Kotchikian or Serge Sarkisian loyalists. So I don't know, maybe it just exemplifies the shift towards them as the only real alternative.
Maybe there are bigger loyalties, right? At least that's what they think about.
Oh yeah, sure, it's possible. Yeah. But it's, again, that those numbers just, it seemed like it was too consolidated, considering that in the previous election, I always remember there would always be diplomats who were, especially members of their families, who just have different opinions.
Moving from Yerevan to Iran, on Friday, voters in the Islamic Republic of Iran went to the polls to elect their 8th president. Not surprisingly, the establishment favorite Ibrahimi Raisi, the country's Chief Justice, was elected with a majority of the votes. This was the expected outcome, since an interview with Foreign Minister Zarifi was prematurely leaked to Western media and essentially damaged his chances to be elected. We had actually talked about this outcome with Robert Markarian on our show a couple of weeks back. Anyway, the new administration will take over in August, and there are concerns that the new president's ultra-conservative policies could have an unclear impact on the country's foreign and domestic policies. Asbed Kotchikian, could you provide a brief overview of the electoral dynamics in Iran and what we can expect with Raisi's presidency?
Oh boy, yes. First of all, I think one of the key issues in the Iran election, the Islamic Republic of Iran elections 2021 and 2020, when there were parliamentary elections, was the low voter turnout. This is the lowest that has ever been recorded in recent elections. Usually presidential elections hover above 70%, whereas this time around it has been less than 50%.
Interesting.
And it's interesting also in this context that even though Ibrahim Raisi got actually 17 million votes, or roughly 60% of the votes, the second highest votes were votes of unaccounted votes or blank votes. So, and that also shows disenchantment and concern. Raisi is a very close ally of the Supreme Leader, Khamenei, but I wouldn't read too much into it, mostly because of the fact that the internal dynamic is very complicated in Iran, where even though you can be ideologically aligned with the Supreme Leader, but the Supreme Leader has in the past, under, for instance, Ahmadinejad, criticized the government for some of its policies. I don't see that happening now, but there would be a lot of interesting surprises there. Himself, Ibrahim Raisi's quite interesting background resume as a law and order president. It seems that this is the theme these days around the world, right? Having the law and order president. And
from the US to Iran.
And Armenia included.
Yeah.
So it's Raisi, I think his main campaign was about the economic hardship. And recently, Mohammad Javad Zarif, actually, just a couple of days ago, in a forum, the diplomatic forum in Antalya, he actually did mention explicitly that they are planning on getting the nuclear deal, done before they hand over power to the incoming administration. So, what I would say overall is the outlook. This is an untested person, and even Raisi, even though he has tough credentials, he is famous for sending 4,000 people to the death row in 1980s. But one of the key components here would be this sync that exists between American and Iranian leaderships. If one looks at the last 15, 20 years, it's quite interesting that every time there was a hardline president in the United States to extend a hand or to withdraw their hand from Iran, there would be a more reformist president in Iran and vice versa. Whenever there would be a hardliner in Iran, there would be a diplomatic overture from the United States. They need the United States as the necessary evil to rally people. But I think the main focus would be probably he will rip the benefits. Raisi will rip the benefits of any nuclear agreement deal that the current administration would make with the United States and ease the sanctions on the country. And their focus will be that, but also obviously mending bridges as they started with regional neighbors, including Saudi Arabia. What the foreign policy will be, that's another dimension that we will have to wait and observe. That's the beauty of Iranian foreign policy or Iranian politics in general, is that as part of their culture, they hold their cards so close, and it's very difficult to even predict, how they will act because there are so many centers of power in the country.
How much of a difference can the president make on foreign policy in Iran?
A lot, a lot. Look, listen, in terms of the foreign policy or in terms of politics in Iran, a lot of people don't understand that the role of the supreme leader is to provide general parameters. The supreme leader does not intervene in the day-to-day operations of politics and internal, domestic, or foreign policy. So the president does have a lot of leeway in terms of shaping and steering foreign policy. The question would be now, the president has the president-elect has to form a cabinet, and they have to be approved by the parliament. That's another dimension that we need to keep an eye on to see how his choices would be approved or unapproved by the parliament. And also, don't forget that there is a 12-member Council of Guardians, or the Guardian Council, that vets and filters any candidates, including parliamentary, presidential, or even cabinet members. So the president would have a lot of leeway and a lot of input in both domestic and foreign policy.
Okay. Emil, do you have any thoughts about the election in Iran?
Not many, really. I mean, it's what Asbed mentioned, this sort of kind of strange dichotomy between U.S. and Iran in terms of hardliners, less hardliners, whatever. But it seems to me, because Iran has this complicated electoral system, right, which takes some time to prepare, and then you have term limits, and then you have terms. They're just sort of playing kind of maybe catch up with the U.S. And by the time they get around to electing a moderate is gone in the U.S. and by the time they get around to respond to a hardliner in the U.S. with their own hardliner, there was a change of government in the U.S. Yeah. So definitely there's this complexity in Iranian politics and this sort of much more diversity of opinion than most Middle Eastern countries. It's just not that efficient, right? It ends up being very inefficient in terms of ability to conduct a foreign policy, ability to project power and influence, etc. Say compared to more hardline regimes like Turkey right now, or some other countries that have the presidents or for life or leaders for life.
Okay.
And one thing, Asbed, if I may add, it's interesting to note that there are a lot of reports that Raisi might be tapped to become the next supreme leader. He's the favorite, even though he's not an Ayatollah, a religious title that he has, but he is a
That
Sayyid,
is pretty interesting.
Which designates that he is descended from the Prophet Muhammad's family and so on. It's an honorific title and so on. And he's also in the Expediency Council, which elects the next supreme leader. So this is very similar to what happened with Khamenei himself, because Khamenei was president back in the 1980s, and then when Khomeini passed away, Khamenei went on the fast track to become an Ayatollah, and he was elected supreme leader. So that could be also an interesting development, because if, assuming Raisi would end up having 2 terms, 8 years, probably the chances that Khamenei would pass away during that time is quite high. That would also show us an interesting development in Iran's sort of supreme leader position.
Asbed, how old is Khamenei?
He's 82 or 83, actually, I think. But he has not been in public role as much. And one of the key things about the supreme leader is that they give Friday sermons once in a while. Khomeini was quite active. Khamenei in early years was also active. And with Khamenei nowadays, the last couple of years, he rarely gave Friday sermons.
All right, moving forward. Thank you, Asbed. Since the start of the 44-day war, Prime Minister Pashinyan has been trying to drag Russia into the conflict. When on May 12th, Azerbaijan penetrated into Armenia proper, taking positions around Sev Lake, a few kilometers into Armenian territory, Pashinyan called on Russia and the CSTO to help again. But Russia has been very circumspect about its involvement in the conflict. It has strong ties and interests in Azerbaijan as well as in Armenia, and it doesn't want to give its neighbor further reasons to go into Turkey's fold. Additionally, it's highly likely that Armenia and Azerbaijan are talking behind the scenes. Emil, what do you think is going on between Armenia and Azerbaijan behind the scenes? Do they have a dialogue open right now?
To the extent that you can have a dialogue with Nikol Pashinyan, yeah, I'm sure it's happening. And we know that there's been a channel between the national security directors or ministers that's been going on even when Vanatsan was national security minister or director, as he mentioned in an interview a couple of days ago. So yes, there is the dialogue. Obviously, it's not a very even level dialogue right now. What I would point out though is that Nikol Pashinyan did not try to drag Russia into the conflict since the start of the 44-day war. As a matter of fact, for the first several weeks, and actually to the end, basically to the time of the November 9 declaration, Pashinyan resisted involving Russia as late as middle of October, when our Armenian army was already defeated. He was talking about no need for Russian peacekeepers and that we're going to win, that kind of stuff. Yeah, I mean, it changed obviously after the defeat, and it sort of went from this super nationalistic position that he had through most of the war into sort of completely defeated and relying completely on Russia position. Going back to what Armenia and Azerbaijan might be talking about, we know about the demarcation agreement. There is some speculation that it's already been signed, but Nikol sort of asked not to publicize it before the election and just publicize it afterwards. And in a sense that, that's been another concession sort of to moderate any kind of Russian support for Kotchikian during the elections. And we've seen that there's been very little overt Russian official support for Kotchikian so far. Of course, there's also been pretty good media coverage on the Russian side in terms of Kotchikian's campaign, especially in recent weeks. And of course, it's related to the fact that there's been obvious surge in support for Kotchikian, clear in sort of public rally that he had just before the vote, and the numbers that we already discussed in terms of polls.
Okay, Asbed, do you have some thoughts on this?
Just a few. I mean, again, this is a situation where, at least in the case of Armenian foreign policy doesn't have the software nor the hardware to conduct any negotiation at this point. In terms of a vision, in terms of diplomats, in terms of seasoned sort of negotiators and all that. And I think to some extent, this is something that Russia, and to lesser extent Russia, but more extent the OSCE, Minsk, or the West, is trying to push like a dialogue or one-on-one negotiation under their supervision between Armenia and Azerbaijan, sort of like, okay, children, go ahead. Now that everything is over, we decided everything. You guys decide on the minor stuff here and there.
Asbed, I'm also confused as to who would be talking to whom. I mean, the foreign minister and all the deputy foreign ministers have resigned. Who would be talking to Azerbaijan?
Well, if the last couple of
the foreign ministry has been shut out of this.
Yeah, I was going to say in the last 6 months or so, everything has been going through Pashinyan. Even before, I think that was also one of the reasons why the foreign ministry, a lot of diplomats in the foreign ministry resigned, or all of the foreign ministry top diplomats resigned, top administrator resigned. So it is one-on-one, probably at a prime minister president level. But again, as I said, I mean, Pashinyan and Armenia in general don't have either the software nor the hardware to be able to stand on their own and provide or get any concessions, if at all, or to give up less concessions than otherwise they would.
This week, as was previously announced, Erdogan was in Shushi. He came to Shushi from a meeting with Biden, where he said that they were supposed to discuss cooperation in the Caucasus, and we don't know what that means. We'll talk about that probably in the next section. But when they came to Shushi, with all the focus on elections, we unfortunately, at least I didn't track what was going on. Emil, can you let us know what the major outcome of this visit was? What is the Shushi or Shusha declaration?
Well, the major outcome was that Turkey lost 0-2 to Wales. That was the main part of the visit for Erdogan. Obviously the UEFA schedule was there. The game was in Baku, and that's why the schedule worked out in a way that he came to Shushi on that day rather than another day. And of course, politically, they had the Shushi declaration. Of course, it sort of reiterated all of the other things, all of the things that they've been doing together, including, taking Armenian territory, killing Armenians, etc. So that was the significance of it, that they would do a declaration in Shushi, which is, of course, the main prize of this war for both Turkey and Azerbaijan. In terms of the content, there was some speculation whether there's, military bases, would be Turkish military bases in Azerbaijan. That's really more of a secondary nature, because already Turkey and Azerbaijan have demonstrated that they can conduct joint military action. That's much more important than having a base in the country, right? Russia has had a base in Armenia since its independence, but they have not conducted joint military action at any point. And whether that's in Armenia versus Azerbaijan context, or say Armenia supporting Russian military action somewhere else. There's the only sort of small involvement of Armenian contingent in Syria, sort of much less than say Armenian involvement in Afghanistan or Iraq. So in effect, Armenian military has actually conducted more direct joint military activity with countries like Germany and Greece and US to some extent than they have with Russia. So that's a real glaring hole there in terms of Armenian-Russian military cooperation. And Turkish and Azerbaijani military cooperation is sort of years ahead of Russian-Armenian military cooperation in that sense, that they conducted a joint war when they went together as brothers in arms. The Azerbaijani government basically removed its military chief and appointed a Turkish, or not appointed, but basically made a Turkish officer commander of its army, and they've basically conducted joint action. Now, will Armenia ever be able to do that with Russia? I don't know. I know as early as, say, for example, in Kotchikian period, there was pressure on Armenia to appoint a Russian officer into joint staff in Armenia, and there was resistance. Armenia rejected it, did not accept a Russian officer to be appointed in the general staff. Right now there's actually one ethnic Russian officer, and he was appointed 2 years ago, I think under Pashinyan already, who is in the Armenian general staff, but he's on a smaller role.
What about the mutual defense component of the pact or the agreement?
Well, that's what I'm saying. They've already demonstrated that they can conduct joint military action. So any kind of military planning against Azerbaijan, whether by Armenia, if Armenia again becomes a sovereign country with the new government, or by Russia, it has to take that into account, that even if there is no Turkish military base in Azerbaijan, it only takes Turkey a couple of weeks to redeploy into Azerbaijan and conduct operations from Azerbaijan, or they can conduct directly from Turkey, right?
But having bases is different than like having a pact that if there's a war, for instance. I understood the mutual defense as if there's a threat to Azerbaijan, then it's a threat to Turkey as well, and automatically Turkey is involved. Is there any component like that, or maybe I'm misreading?
There is never an automatic component like that. It's not like an automatic airbag or something that's just gonna come out because of some kind of pressure. It's always political decision making, whether it makes sense at this point considering all the other factors. So, for example, if Russia says, okay, we're tired of this mess, we're going to take over Azerbaijan, we're going to take all the pipelines there, make Azerbaijan part of our sphere of influence, and forget about everything else. I don't think Turkey is really going to do anything about it. They're not going to go die for Azerbaijan's independence. But if it's on the margins of Russia's trying to do some kind of small operation, they could maybe oppose it in some way, etc. So it really depends on a larger picture. And so far, Azerbaijan has been able to sort of fit its interest into this larger picture much better than Armenia, especially this current government.
One thing I want to add is that Turkish-Azerbaijani military cooperation, actually, when Emil mentioned that they have a closer cooperation that Armenia and Russia did, is to keep in mind that there was a warp speed increase in cooperation in the last couple of years. So that's also something to keep in mind. And when it comes to the Shusha Declaration, as they're calling it, I think it's interesting to see that they did mention about the military cooperation and coordination at naval, air force, and army bases as well. So it's major. Maybe it could be a major overhaul of also Azerbaijani military doctrine and military strategy and so on. One other thing I want to mention, as since people, a lot of people, especially in the Caucasus, pay a lot of attention to symbolism, is that the Shusha Declaration, in a way, also reaffirmed the Kars Treaty of 1921, almost 100 years to the day. The Kars Treaty was signed, I think, in October, which actually established the boundaries between Soviet Union and Turkey, as well as defining the status of Nakhichevan and so on and so forth. So, symbolism is something that people there just love, and also a reaffirmation of that. And finally, it's interesting to see that the cautious responses from Russia about the idea of creating or establishing a Turkish army base. And one final thought is that all of this is coming at the footsteps of Erdogan's meeting with Biden, but at the same time about the role of Turkey in NATO, and to what extent any kind of a cooperation with Azerbaijan would have a NATO component.
Well, Asbed, Russia didn't come out and put a red line in those words, but it did respond to the declaration and to the intention to put a Turkish base in Azerbaijan.
Right. It wasn't. That's what I meant in terms of that. It wasn't a direct response. It was just an intention or a mood sort of declaration of their mood about it, like in a way that we're not entertained by this idea. We're not amused by this idea, kind of a thing.
Right.
But it's something that it might also be for popular consumption in Turkey and Azerbaijan about establishing Turkish military base in Azerbaijan.
At the start of this week, Biden met with Turkish President Erdogan. After that meeting, Erdogan went to Azerbaijan, as we said. Meanwhile, Biden went to Geneva and met with Russian President Putin. This was covered a lot in the press, but I don't know in what level of detail. Asbed, what was the Erdogan meeting with Biden about? Maybe we can begin with that.
It was part of as you mentioned, it was part of the larger Biden meeting in Europe with the G7 meetings, but then also Erdogan and then Russia. With Erdogan, it's interesting that I think the Biden and the United States is trying to sort of mend bridges and give Turkey or bring Turkey away from Russia. Two things which are very important in that meeting. A is that the Turkey took over the Afghanistan Kabul airport security after the U.S. is withdrawing from there. So that's one thing in terms of their commitment with NATO and NATO activities. And the other one, however, which was a sticking point, and that was Turkey buying S-400s from Russia. And Erdogan basically blatantly mentioned that, this is not up for negotiation and we're still going to go ahead with this. So I wouldn't put past Erdogan to try to play on, on DC and on Moscow, showing that while he's closely cooperating with Russia, he still is a needed, not a reliable, but a needed partner for the US and for the West.
Do you know if there's any news about what kind of cooperation, if any, Erdogan was talking about in the Caucasus?
Not that I noticed. One of the things about Armenian media or Armenian focused media is that when it comes to these meetings, they always say they are also going to talk about Nagorno-Karabakh or the South Caucasus. Whereas, when it comes to U.S. foreign policy and their negotiations, this is just a footnote, if that is even. So I didn't find anything specific about Turkish role in the South Caucasus in Erdogan's discussion with Biden. It was more about Afghanistan, which is a bigger fish to fry, as well as the issue of buying weapons from Russia.
Right.
On this point of Armenian issues coming up in this big summits, the only thing that I noticed is that sort of Erdogan promised to raise his objections of Armenian genocide resolution with Biden, but then they kind of forgot about it. And Putin was going to bring up Russian peacekeeping role in Karabakh with Biden, but it's not clear if they got to it. So that just gives you a sense, and of course on the Biden side, there's nothing. I don't see any Armenian anything there. It just didn't make it. It didn't make the list. That kind of tells you the extent to which Armenian issues worry or concern Biden administration. It's the same level as Trump administration, sort of between 0 to 0.00. I don't know what number. So,
did they just meet and ran out of time and maybe didn't get to the?
No, it's just they don't care. It's not. There's no concern. The community here is unable to make that an issue here. So that's what just tells you. the reality is. And I mean, it's not like it's impossible to make it an issue. It's possible to make it an issue, but it's not. So Biden, Putin, it reminded me again of sort of an effort to kind of restart relations, just as it happened with Obama and Putin, and then Trump and Putin. So they kind of have this first positive meeting, and then all this negative stuff starts to drop in, and then relations kind of don't get anywhere. So far we have satisfied this first initial positive step, but we'll see if there is actually an agenda where they can sort of positively cooperate. And ever since really early 2000s, when Bush focus was on terrorism in Middle East or Middle Eastern radical groups, there's never been a real positive agenda where Russia and the U.S. could jointly cooperate. And as a matter of fact, there's been more disagreements, right? So it's unclear where that agenda is going to come from. Obviously, it's not coming from COVID, where they're all fighting for this vaccine market share or whatever, or it doesn't come from jointly confronting China, where Russia is sort of junior partner to China. So we'll see where it actually goes, but most likely it's gonna, there's gonna be some kind of issues over the horizon or coming soon that will again sort of create tense situations.
And speaking of tense, I mean, besides the Cuban Missile Crisis, in terms of diplomats being ousted from each other's countries, have Russia and U.S. Relations been at such a low level? And then why do you think the meeting was prioritized now? I mean, obviously, of course, yes, they want to improve relations, but specifically, I'm talking about one of the points.
It's not that they necessarily want to improve relations; they want to manage the problems at a manageable level, right? So
but one of the problems, or one of the points on the agenda, I believe that the U.S. wanted to raise was sale of Russian missile technology to China. So was China like the big elephant in the room with Biden and Putin? And maybe I guess the U.S. calculation is that it needs to sort of contain China with the help of Russia by some trade, giving back and forth.
Well, Hovik, one of the things about China came up in the G7 meetings, right? In the declaration, they talked about the fact that Europe and the G7 have to actually work closely to counter China's rise. So in that case, to what extent Russia is relevant or could be relevant when you have these polarization between the West on the G7 on the one hand and China on the other. I think in this case, as Emil mentioned, China is a junior partner or a junior player in the China-West kind of a dichotomy.
Yeah, Russia is a junior partner. Yeah, in China, Russia-China relations.
Yeah,
but in terms of again the agenda, there was I saw the NBC News interview with Putin, and sort of right out of the gates, he's being asked about transfer of technology to Iran. So that's another issue that's always been sort of key issue in U.S.-Russia agenda, limiting the type of military technology that Iran can acquire from Russia. And there's been a number of times when Russia delayed transfers or limited transfers to sort of appease the West and get them off Russia's back somewhat. So again, there might be some trade-off there as well. Returning to the Iran and returning to the Armenian elections, we now have the turnout number, and it's 49.4% of eligible voters have voted, and that's slightly more than in 2018. And it looks like Yerevan turnout was higher than average, which again is unusual. Normally Yerevan doesn't turn out as well as the provinces, but
Pashinyan is claiming that they are running exit polls with a huge lead. They're saying that they have a 50% lead, but they got 50%. But obviously, we have to take those with a grain of salt. But that's interesting because, honestly, I don't know where this will go. So with that, let's close today's show. Thank you for everyone. Our guests today were Asbed Kotchikian and Emil Sanamyan, and we'll talk next week.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, gentlemen.
All right, bye-bye.
That concludes our program for this Week in Review episode. We hope it has helped your understanding of some of the issues from the previous week. We look forward to your feedback and your suggestions for issues to cover in greater depth. Contact us on our website at groong.org or on our Facebook page ANN-Groong, or in our Facebook group, Groong-Armenian News Network. Special thanks to Laura Osborne for providing the music for our podcast. On behalf of everyone in this episode, we wish you a good week. Don't forget to subscribe to our channels, like our pages, and follow us on social media. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.